Hello, my name's Gavin, and this is Genre Books, and this is my May reading roundup. It's been a bit of a disappointing month in terms of number of books read compared to number I was hoping to read. On the plus side, it was a great month because I found some authors that are new to me and ones that I think I will enjoy reading more of their works. May, of course, is horror mayhem, but there were other events happening, not least of which was the continuation of Spring into Adventure. For this, I read The Adventures of Gerard by Arthur Conan Doyle, and I have to say I enjoyed it immensely. I knew this was about a soldier in the Napoleonic Wars. I did not know it was about a French soldier in the Napoleonic Wars. As Conan Doyle is writing for a predominantly British audience, I thought this was a bold move. But as I got into the book, you could understand why. Brigadier Gerard is a little bit in love with himself. He is his own hype man. In recounting his exploits, he shows a huge array of character flaws, but it's a very lovable way in which he's done this. In narrating it this way, Doyle is able to show a number of character flaws whilst at the same time making us like Gerard himself. Doyle is also able to praise the British side of things by showing the grudging respect that Gerard shows to the British soldiers and to the Prussians when it comes to Waterloo, and the damning with faint praise that he gives the French side of things, the backhanded insults, which I'm sure Gerard did not intend, and I'm sure Doyle did, towards Napoleon himself, who does make an appearance. But underpinning this is just swashbuckling boys' own adventure fun. You can also see the influence in this writing to Burroughs, for example. In fact, there is a line in The Adventures of Gerard which I think is one that is repeated in the Barsoom series on more than one occasion, and that is, "With me, to think is to act," which is a great precondition for adventure stories. No rumination, just straight on into the action. An adventure of a different type, but also one that allowed me to shoehorn it into Spring into Adventure, is my continuing trawl through my collection of Lawrence Vanderpost books, and this month was The Lost World of the Kalahari. Again, Vanderpost finds himself on a mission in Africa, a different part of Africa, to venture to the interior, and a different reason for doing so. In Venture to the Interior, he's sent at the behest of the British government to look at suitable areas for farming. With this book, it's much more of a personal journey, and it's one that he organises and funds himself. There are on YouTube, I may link these below, videos of the actual expedition, because it was partially funded by the BBC when he made a documentary for them. As I'm finding with a lot of Vanderpost, there's a lot to keep you thinking. There's certainly an element of paternalism in his treatment of Africa and Africans, but there's also a huge amount of respect for the tribal peoples that he meets. There's not a small amount of guilt that comes across. A larger dose than I expected of spiritualism. Now, I'm not putting Van der Post down as some proto-hippie, but he is certainly thinking about the colonial experience in a very different way to how you might expect it to be described. Maybe I've read these things round the wrong way. I've read my post-colonial literature before I've read my colonial literature. I certainly don't think Van der Post is right all the time, but neither is he unthinking, unreasoning, or unwilling to change his mind, which, I think is possibly the most important facet. Anyway, I shall enjoy carrying on this series of books throughout the rest of the year. But enough about adventures. May was about horror mayhem, and at the beginning of the month I visited Lamb House in Rye. The house was lived in by Henry James, and as this was local horror, it was quite annoying that he had finished The Turn of the Screw literally just before he moved in. He was having the decorators work on the house. If he hadn't, The Turn of the Screw may well have been written in Lamb House. Some 20 odd years later, E.F. Benson moved in and ended up as the mayor of Rye, apart from anything else. But it was a perfect local horror excuse to read not only a collection of E.F. Benson ghost stories, this is the Outcast and Other Dark Tales, but also to read the life of E.F. Benson. The National Trust is the custodian of Lamb House, and with National Trust properties you often find an adjacent bookshop. Here there wasn't a bookshop as such, but in the ticket office there was 2 shelves of books, and I managed to pick this up. This is much more about the entire family of Bensons than just talking about Fred Benson, but that's the story that needs to be told. I don't often read biographies. I really enjoyed this one. The second week of Horror Mayhem was movie horror, and I chose a novelisation of a film and a novel which became a big film. Now that was The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty, and having been warned about how horrific this was, it doesn't disappoint on that level. I think if you are a religious person at all, this would affect you all the more. For a book that has a limited geographical scope of action and a fairly limited amount of characters, I think it does a really good job. I think I'm not entirely sure how good an ear Blatty has for dialogue. I did find myself reading some exchanges a couple of times to make sense of it, and I think it's because he's trying to be a little too slick in how the characters communicate with each other, where they are people who are obviously very familiar with each other and are able to speak in half sentences. But that's quibbling. What we're really here for is the horror, and the book delivers on that front in spades. A book I was pleasantly surprised by during the month is the second of the movie horror week, and that was Pomenette's Nosferatu, a novelisation of the Werner Herzog film, itself a remake of Nosferatu, itself an interpretation of Dracula, written by Bram Stoker. So I think I've got all those links in the chain correct. If you're expecting something to read like Bram Stoker's Dracula, think again. This book was unexpected because, having read a little about the writer, I suppose I didn't quite know what to expect. I think there was some poetry that he wrote, but he also wrote other novelizations, including, I believe, for Predator. But this is not your normal novelization. I'm not just talking about the addition of the internal thought processes of the characters, which you would get in many other novelizations, and why novelizations are sometimes better than the movies, but just the whole treatment of nature, the way he depicts nature being corrupted by Nosferatu and turning against humanity is absolutely fantastic. Very much enjoyed this book. Then came Classics Week, and the first book I read is an ebook, and that was Mary Schweidler, The Amber Witch, by William Meinhold. I made a whole video about this book, but briefly, it is a literary hoax perpetrated by a Pomeranian priest in order to get one over on those naughty people who want to write about Jesus as a historical figure. The story itself is one of a witch trial which took place in 17th century Pomerania, the nefarious activities of the local nobility, the real witchcraft that was going on there apparently, and the gullibility of the local populace and their fickleness in their treatment of members of their own community. The translation, I think, is excellent. It makes you believe you are reading 16th century German translated, updated to 19th century German, translated to 19th century English. The reasons why William Meinhold wrote the book are long since irrelevant. All we are left with now is the text itself, and it still holds up as enjoyable. I also read in the classics The Night Spiders by John Lymington. Now, although this says corgi science fiction, it has about as much to do with science fiction as it does with corgis. These are horror stories, pure and simple. They are very short stories, a few pages long at most, and as with all collections, not everyone hits, not everyone is quite as horrific and terrifying as perhaps the author intended, but there's some very enjoyable vignettes in here. One other thing that I read in e-format during the month is a 100-year-old issue of Weird Tales. This was Weird Tales' first anniversary issue and was a bumper issue. It must have had, I'd say, 20 to 25 short stories in it. Some of those short stories not quite so short, interspersed with a number of small essays, historical oddities, tales of coincidence, and tales of sort of gruesome medieval torture. Again, I did a whole video on the contents of this magazine, so I won't bore you by going over it again. You can find the video and be bored by it all anew. What it did lead me to find out was that H.P. Lovecraft was ghostwriting for Houdini and was also one of Houdini's investigators uncovering fraudulent spiritualist and ghostly activity. And then we came to modern horror, and I don't have much in the way of modern horror. I didn't get a chance to get to Stephen King. I didn't get a chance to get to James Herbert. I'm making this video on the 27th, so it's possible, if I got really lucky, that I did get round to one of those, But as I am only a third of the way into The Beetle by Richard Marsh, it is unlikely I will be able to get to both of those authors by the end of the month. What I did read for modern horror, however, and which was again a pleasant surprise, was The Fiends in the Furrows, a short anthology of recent modern folk horror. So think The Wicker Man and you're not far off. Not every story hits the mark, but there are some great short stories in here, and I would be interested to find the second and third volumes of these anthologies to continue reading the selections of folk horror. But that's it, and that's where the disappointment comes in. I have not read as much of the Promethean horror book as I would hope to have done. I have started The Pillow Book by Say Schweidler, but I've not finished that either. There were other adventure books I wanted to read. The ghost-written Alistair MacLean, The Arabian Sands of Wilfrid Thesiger will be unexplored for maybe another year. I may have to reclassify some of these books as garbage or non-fiction to enable me to shoehorn them into events later in the year. Let's hope I'm really able to put my nose to the grindstone for June and June on the Range, because I certainly have a lot of books to get through there. But until then, bye.